Alara woke before the sun. She always did, not because anyone told her to, but because servants who slept too long were servants who got noticed, and getting noticed was the one thing she had spent 4 years carefully avoiding. She folded her sleeping mat with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, smoothed her plain gray dress, and tied her hair back so tightly it pulled at her temples. Then she picked up her tray and walked out into the long stone corridor of the Ashvale Palace, just another shadow moving through a world that belonged to someone else. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. The palace was magnificent in the way that power is always magnificent, cold, enormous, and built to remind you how small you are. Gold ran along the edges of every doorframe. The ceilings were so high that sound got lost before it reached them. Guards stood at every corridor junction, still as carved stone, eyes that moved even when their bodies did not. Alara moved between them, like water through rock, noticed enough to step aside for, forgotten the moment she passed. She collected documents from the royal archivist before the morning bell, delivered them to the legal steward's chamber, and returned the empty tray to the East Wing kitchen. She did this every day. It was a good route. It kept her away from the throne room, away from the main hall, and away from the one person in this palace she spent every waking hour avoiding. She almost made it through the morning without incident. The flooded corridor changed everything. A pipe had burst in the main hall overnight, and 3 of the interior passageways were closed off for repair. She heard the guards redirecting foot traffic as she turned a corner, and before she could change her own route, she was already in the east corridor, the one she never took, the one that ran parallel to the royal wing, and there were footsteps ahead of her, steady and unhurried, and carrying the particular weight of someone who had never needed to rush, because the world simply waited. She dropped to her knees beside a marble column and set her tray down and kept her eyes on the floor. The footsteps slowed. She told herself it was nothing. A pause, a guard waiting for instruction. She pressed her fingers flat against the cold stone and breathed through her nose, slow and even, the way Mara had taught her when she was 7 years old and afraid of storms. Be still. Be so still the world forgets to look at you. She was still. But the pause continued. And then, from somewhere directly above her, she felt it, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Something shifted in the air, something old and searching, and deeply, terribly awake. She made the mistake of looking up. He was not what stories said he was. Stories said the Alpha King was a wall of rage, with a crown on top. What she saw was a man in dark traveling clothes, lean and composed, with gray eyes that were currently doing something she had not prepared for. They were studying her. Not the way lords studied servants, with the vague assessment of someone checking furniture for dust. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something that should not exist, that breaks a rule they were certain could not be broken. She dropped her gaze immediately. Her heart was doing something very loud and unhelpful inside her chest. He said nothing. After a moment that lasted considerably longer than any moment had a right to last, he walked on. His footsteps faded. Alara stayed on her knees for another count of 30 before she trusted her legs enough to stand. She told herself it was nothing for 3 days. She was very convincing. She had years of practice convincing herself that things were nothing, because the alternative, that things were something, led to places she could not afford to go. On the 4th day, she was summoned to the royal library. The message came through the head archivist, framed politely as a request for someone with document clearance to assist with an unsorted archive section. It was entirely routine. Alara accepted it with a nod, and walked to the library with her hands loose at her sides, and her expression the careful blankness she wore like a second skin. The library was the most beautiful room in the palace. She had thought so the first time she glimpsed it through an open door, 2 years ago, and she thought so again now. Shelves that climbed so high they needed ladders on rails, thousands of books in every color of binding, the smell of old paper and cedar oil, and something warm she could never quite name. A crate of unsorted scrolls sat in the far corner. She went to it. The Alpha King was at his desk near the window, reading. He did not look up when she entered. She began to work. The scrolls were a mess, 3 different eras of documentation jumbled together, some in common tongue, some in older trade script, and some in a language she recognized in her blood before she recognized it in her mind. Her hands slowed on one particular scroll. She read 3 lines before she caught herself and placed it carefully back in the crate. From across the room, without looking up from his own work, "Can you read Old Silvermoon's script?" The question landed very quietly in the room. She said, "No, my lord," and kept her face exactly where it was. He said nothing else, but when she left an hour later, she knew he had seen exactly where her hand rested on the scroll and exactly where she had stopped reading, and that those 2 facts had told him everything her words had tried to undo. She walked back to the east wing and pressed herself against the corridor wall and breathed. She had 4 years of careful invisibility behind her. She suspected she had very little of it left. The library sessions continued, and she did not know what to do with that. Every evening during the week that followed, she was summoned again. The crate was refilled with new scrolls. He worked at his desk. She worked in her corner. They existed in the same room and did not speak about the only thing that mattered. He tested her. She understood that. A historical text left near her crate, written entirely in Silvermoon. A passing comment about the Old Kingdom, delivered at exactly the right moment to catch a reaction. He was methodical and patient, and she recognized the shape of it, because she had been methodical and patient herself for 4 years, and it takes one careful person to truly see another. She gave him nothing, but they also talked. It started with a treaty, an old one, badly translated, that she corrected in her mind before she could stop herself, and he noticed the small sound she made, and asked what she had found, and she answered because the historical error was too significant to ignore, and then he disagreed with her interpretation, and she disagreed back. It was the first real conversation she had in 4 years. She hated how much she did not hate it. He was not what she had built in her mind. She had built a monster, because that was what she needed, something simple and dark that she could hold her anger against. What she found instead was a man who read seriously, thought carefully, and listened in a way that most kings apparently did not bother to do. It made everything more complicated. She resented the complication. But she came back every evening. And somewhere in the second week, the thing she had been suppressing her entire life stopped behaving. It started as warmth, the kind that had nothing to do with temperature, a pull, quiet but persistent, like a tide that does not announce itself, but moves everything in its direction anyway. She felt it first. She knew what it was. She had grown up knowing exactly what it was and why she could never acknowledge it, and why fate, in this particular case, had a very cruel sense of humor. She kept her face toward the scrolls. She kept breathing. The confrontation came on a still night in the 3rd week, with the sounds of the court banquet drifting faintly from the other wing and the library holding its breath around them. He set a document on the table in front of her. It was a genealogy record. She knew the crest on the header before she read a single line. She had seen it once, on a small torn piece of cloth that Mara kept at the bottom of a wooden box and never spoke about and cried over, sometimes, when she thought Ilara was asleep. He had marked a single entry near the bottom. A child, female, presumed dead. He said, "Tell me her name." Ilara looked at the document for a long time. The fire in the hearth crackled. Music from the banquet moved through the walls like something remembered rather than heard. She said, "Ilara Orlin, daughter of Seraphine and Kaelin Orlin, last of the Silvermoon line." She looked up at him, "Which you already knew." He was quiet. Then, "How long have you been in my court?" 4 years. "And before that?" "Hidden, as my mother asked." The word mother sat between them like a stone dropped into water, and the ripples moved through everything. He asked, very quietly, "Are you here for revenge?" She considered it seriously, because it was a serious question, and she did not believe in answering real questions carelessly. Then she said, "I am here, because there was nowhere else safe. Revenge requires power I have not had. I was not waiting for a moment. I was surviving." He absorbed this. She watched him do it, watched the calculation move through his expression, and then something underneath the calculation, something that had no name she could give it easily. He said, "The bond." She said, "Yes." Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire burned. The music played. The world outside the library continued without them, and for once, she did not feel the need to keep up with it. She did not forgive him that night. She would not pretend she did. He had burned a palace. He had taken a throne. He had made her an orphan before she had words for what parents were. The bond between them was a fact of biology and bloodline, not a solution to any of that, and she refused to let anyone, including herself, treat it as one. She told him this, directly, the following evening. He said, "I know." She said, "I will not be used as a political advantage." He said, "I am aware." She said, "Then what do you want?" He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the corridor, with that attention that felt less like observation and more like recognition. He said, "To understand what I did, and whether it can be answered for." It was not an apology. She was not ready to receive an apology, and she suspected he was not built for simple ones anyway. But it was honest, in the particular way that only a person who has stopped hiding from themselves can be honest. She did not forgive him, but she stopped planning her exit. The court found out on a Tuesday, the way secrets always find their way out, through someone who was looking for something else entirely. One of the senior lords brought the information to a council meeting with the energy of a man presenting a weapon. He laid it out methodically: the servant girl, the Silver Moon bloodline, the security threat, the wartime law that covered exactly this situation. He used the word pretender 4 times. He was very satisfied with himself. Dorian sat at the head of the long council table and listened to the entire presentation without expression. Then he said, "She is not a pretender. She is the last Silver Moon heir, and she is under my protection." The room erupted. He let it run for a while, the way a person lets a fire burn through dry grass, because stopping it early only drives it underground. When the noise settled, he added, "The matter of the Silver Moon bloodline will be addressed at the appropriate time, in the manner I determine. That is my decision." He dismissed the session. Ilara heard about it through the servant network she had maintained quietly for 4 years, the invisible web of people who carried trays and scrubbed floors, and saw everything precisely because no one thought to close the door before they spoke. She sat in the library alone that evening. She had spent 4 years calculating. She had spent 4 years preparing for every version of discovery except this one. The version where the man who owed her the most chose, in front of his entire court and against every political convenience, to say her name and defend it. She did not know what to do with that. She decided she did not have to know yet. She was good at waiting. 3 months later, on a morning when the early light came through the palace windows at the angle that made the stone floors look like water, Ilara Orellin stood in the great hall of the Ashvale court and let them see her. She wore the deep gold of the Silver Moon house. She had found it in the archive, catalogued as miscellaneous historical textiles, folded with a care that suggested someone had saved it on purpose, in the hope that someone would one day come back for it. She thought about that person, whoever they were. She was grateful to them. The recognition was formal and legally precise. The Silver Moon bloodline was acknowledged not as a threat, not as an absorption, but as its own authority. A parallel sovereignty, a power, with its own history and its own right to stand. Dorian stood beside her, not in front. That had been her only formal request, delivered through the court secretary in 3 plain sentences. He had agreed without commentary, which told her more about who he was choosing to be than any speech could have. She was not healed. She understood that. Healing was not an event, but a direction, and she had only just begun to face it. He was not absolved. He understood that too, and it said something that he did not look away from it. What she knew, standing in that hall, in that golden dress, with the weight of a name she had carried in secret her entire life, finally resting where it belonged, visible, spoken, real, was that she had survived, not by luck, not by mercy, by being patient and careful, and absolutely unwilling to disappear completely, even when disappearing was the only safe choice. Her mother had asked her to be no one. She had been no one. And now, in her own time, in the manner she had chosen, she was done. She was Ilara Orellin. She had come home.